What's up, TUMNAD Lectures? In today's video, we are going to be talking about what we call the esophageal phase of deglutition. If you find it helpful at the end of it, please make sure you like the video, comment down in the comment section, and then subscribe. Let's go ahead and get started, okay? So now, in the previous videos, we have been talking about the deglutition mechanism. We started with what we call the oral phase. We moved to what we call the pharyngeal phase, and now we are in what we call the oesophageal phase, which is the last phase as the bolus moves through what you call the esophagus down to the stomach. Okay, so now this one is going to be one of the most easiest kind of the phase of deglutition, because the most important thing which we are going to be talking about is how the bolus is going to be propelled down to what we call the stomach. Okay, so now the first key important things in what we call the esophageal phase is that this phase is also going to be under what we call autonomic nervous control. In that way, we say that this phase is also under involuntary control. Okay, so now this phase is also going to be under involuntary. Going to be also under what we call involuntary control. Okay, and when we talk of involuntary control, it means that everything happening in this phase are going to be automated. Okay, and also another thing which is very important is that where is this phase going to be starting and where is it going to be ending. Okay, it is going to be starting. Where is it going to be starting and where is it going to be ending? Okay, we need to know where is it going to start and where is it going to end. Something very important. So now this one here is the diagram showing all the phases of what we call the deglutition. We started from here as the oral phase. We moved here to what we call the pharyngeal phase. Now our bolus is what we call in the esophagus, and that's why we are explaining what we call the esophageal phase. Okay, so now the esophageal phase is going to start whenever this kind of bolus passes through what we call the upper esophageal sphincter. Okay, so now it is starting when the bolus passes through what we call the upper esophageal sphincter. Okay, so now the moment the bolus passes through what we call the upper esophageal sphincter, we now start what we call the esophageal phase, and it is going to end whenever this kind of the bolus passes through what we call the lower esophageal sphincter. Okay, so now when the bolus passes through the lower esophageal sphincter. Okay, so now when the bolus passes the lower esophageal sphincter down to the stomach, that marks the end of what we call the esophageal phase. Super very important. Okay, now that our bolus in the esophagus, what do we need? How are we going to be propelling this kind of the bolus down into what we call the stomach? Now, there are two kinds of the mechanisms that are going to be involved in this kind of what we call the esophageal phase. The first one, we say that we have what we call the inner circular layer of muscles of the pharynx, which we called the pharyngeal constrictors. Now, these muscles, they started what we call pharyngeal peristalis. Okay, the downward movement of what we call the bolus by what we call the pharyngeal peristalis. Now, when it reaches into what we call the esophagus, we call the pharyngeal peristalis is now going to be continuing down in what we call the esophagus. So you know how this wave of contraction is called in the esophagus? It is what we call the primary peristalis. Okay, so now in the esophagus, we are going to be having what we call primary peristalis. Okay, so now the primary peristalis is going to be a continuation of what we call the pharyngeal peristalis. Okay, so now the primary peristalis is going to be a continuation. Okay, it's going to be a continuation of pharyngeal, what we call the pharyngeal peristalis. Okay, so now as the pharyngeal peristalis moves the bolus and it enters to what we call the esophagus, then the primary peristalis is going now to be continuing this kind of the bolus down until it reaches the stomach. As simple as that, okay? Sometimes the bolus can be too a bit big, or it can even be some kind of the dryness, and then it gets a bit stuck in what we call the esophagus. So now, let's say, for example, this bolus is getting stuck in what we call the esophagus. So now, how are we going to be moving down this kind of the bolus which is getting stuck in the esophagus? There's another kind of the mechanism how this kind of the bolus is going to be moving down. Now, when this kind of the bolus gets stuck in the esophagus, it is going to be causing that kind of the stretch, okay? It's going to be causing the stretch of the muscles of this what we call the esophagus. And in that way, we have what we call stretch receptors that are going to be becoming much activated. When they get activated, they will move and go and innervate, they go and stimulate what we call one of the branch of the enteric nervous system. You know how this branch is called? They are going to be now stimulating what we call the myenteric plexus, okay? And by doing that, the myenteric plexus now will now make a very much strong wave of the contraction to make sure that the upper part of the bolus is contracting while the lower part of the bolus is relaxing. And by doing that, that powerful strong wave of contraction second to what we call activation of the myenteric nervous system. You know how this wave is called? Is what we call the secondary peristalis, okay? So now we are going to also be having what we call the secondary peristalis, okay? So now this secondary peristalis by activation of the myenteric nervous system is going to be aiming at pushing what we call the stuck bolus in the esophagus, okay? So now this one is only activated whenever there is a bolus which is stuck in the esophagus, okay? Which is stuck in the esophagus, okay? So now this secondary peristasis is coming as a result of anything which is stuck in the esophagus to make a more powerful wave of contraction that will push it down to the stomach, okay? Now, as our bolus moves down, it's going to be passing this kind of this muscular structure, super very important, that allows the entry of the bolus into the stomach. You know how this sphincter is called? This sphincter here is what we call the lower esophageal sphincter, okay? It can also be called the cardiac sphincter. It can also be called the gastroesophageal sphincter, okay? The gastroesophageal sphincter. It has a couple of names, okay? So now the moment the bolus bypasses this kind of the sphincter, then we finally say bye-bye to what we call the bolus. However, this bolus is now going to go into another world, and this world is super very dangerous. You know why I'm saying that it's dangerous? He is going to be now suffering with gastric juice, and the powerful content of the gastric juice is going to be what we call the hydrochloric acid. So now we have now subjected our bolus to what we call the hydrochloric acid, and even also what we call the pepsin, and even also what we call the lipase. Okay, so now we are sending this kind of the bolus to go and suffer with this kind of contents of what we call the gastric juice. Okay, so now our bolus is now in the stomach, and now it is able to be chemically digested, and even also some little of what we call mechanical digestion. Okay, so now this briefly covers what we call the esophageal phase. Okay, so now this briefly covers what we call the esophageal phase of the deglutition. And the most important thing to note here is that we're going to be having the primary peristasis, which is a continuation of what we call the pharyngeal peristasis. When the bolus gets stuck in the esophagus, we're going to be activating what we call the myenteric. Okay, and this myenteric is going to be now making a strong wave of contraction, which we are calling the secondary peristasis, to move that kind of the bolus which is stuck in the esophagus down into what we call the stomach. As the bolus reaches on this kind of the sphincter, this sphincter is going to be relaxing, and then it moves into what we call the stomach. Now, the most important kind of the cranial nerve, which is going to be controlling all of these kind of the esophageal events happening here, is what we call the vagus nerve. Okay, now the most important last thing to talk about is that what are some of those factors that are going to be aiding in the downward movement of this kind of the bolus? There are going to be mainly three factors that aid in the downward movement of this bolus. The first one is what we call the primary peristalsis. Okay, primary peristalsis, that's number one. And then number two, gravity. Okay, gravity is also going to be playing a very important role. Whenever someone is eating and you are swallowing, when you're in upright position, it also adds on what we call the downward movement of what we call the bolus. Okay, and even also the last one is going to be what we call the mucus. Okay, esophageal mucus. So now, if the esophagus is having a lot of the mucus, that will also lubricate the down movement of the bolus by reducing what we call friction. Besides reducing the friction, it is also aiming at making sure that this kind of the bolus doesn't damage what we call the esophagus as it is moving down. Okay, so now these are the three factors that aid in the downward movement of what we call the bolus. Primary peristalsis, that way of the contraction, the gravity, and even also what we call the mucus coming from what we call the esophageal glands. Okay, super very important and beautiful. So now that briefly covers what we call the esophageal phase. And if you think whatever I've talked is making sense, it's adding to you, you are benefiting, please hit the like button, comment down in the comment section, and then subscribe. Thank you very much for watching. TUMNAD as always. Until we meet next time.